Nu måste vi ge plats för vår nästa föreläsare här på upphandlingsdagarna. Vi ska höra om vad OECD har för rekommendationer för effektiv implementation av offentliga upphandlingssystem. And please welcome on stage Paolo Magina, Head of the Public Procurement Unit at the Public Governance Directorate in OECD. Here he is.
Hello.
You're most welcome. The stage is yours, and you're prepared to answer a couple of questions in connection with your presentation as well.
Okay.
Så känn er fria att ställa frågor också via vårt frågesystem här, som jag hoppas att ni har fått meddelande om. Så, here you go.
Mina svenska vänner, jag hör mycket glad över att vara med här idag att tala om superoffentlig upphandling. So, I'm not going to continue in Swedish, don't worry. So, it's just because two months ago I attended and I presented the OECD work in Oslo. And we have an Icelandic colleague, and he helped me in that presentation to start something similar. And I decided to do the same thing here because it's after lunch, and I believe I need to capture your attention. So that was the reason. You will see that I have two questions in my first slide. The first one is if the OECD recommendation is a standard for the 21st century. And the second one is if this is going to be a great contracting year, something like that. So the first one is on me, but the second one is on you to deliver. It's each one of you will have to come up with the best in order to make public procurement a better work. So I will try to cover many topics. I was invited by Peter Blomberg. Thank you so much for the invitation. He challenged me to show you the OECD work on public procurement, so I have many topics. I will try to go briefly through some of them. You will have the presentation, and then we can, of course, follow up later. So I will start by explaining a little bit what is the OECD, what we are doing in general in public policies, why public procurement matters, the OECD recommendation on public procurement, the use of public procurement to achieve secondary policy objectives, how to go green, some evidence and data on central purchasing bodies, and also key performance indicators. So basically, most of you are familiar with OECD. The OECD is the global organization, and our motto is better policies for better lives. And we bring countries and governments to Paris in order to exchange and talk about policy experiences, identify good practices, and try to come up with recommendations to improve the well-being of people around the world. We have 34 member countries. Most of them come from the developed world, from New Zealand to the United States, from Chile to Japan, the vast majority of European countries, and of course Sweden. We also have some countries lined up to be members of the OECD, Colombia, Costa Rica, Latvia and Lithuania, and we have also some key partners like China, India, Indonesia, South Africa and Brazil. Russia is a special situation now because it was in the accession process, but because of the recent developments, it's now on hold. Some fast facts about the OECD. We cover 2/3 of the world trade, 60% of the world GDP. We bring together more than 100,000 delegates to Paris every year, but we just represent 18% of the world population. We are part of a global community. We work together with many international organizations and IFIs, most notably, of course, the WTO, the G20, the European Union, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the World Bank, and many others. So we are here because public procurement matters, and public procurement really matters because it's a crucial pillar of strategic use for governments. It's the most single important activity a government can conduct in order to impact the economy and the society. And this is something that I'm sure that you are aware of, but it's never, we need to say it over and over. And because it's a high-risk area due to the close interaction between the private and the public sector, governments need to ensure that the objectives of public procurement are clear, they work together, and overlaps or conflicts are avoided. We heard this morning, and the only presentation I could really follow was the one from Sue. But we heard that, of course, the EU directives are difficult. We need to apply them consistently, and so the governments, they really face the challenge. But more than the governments, because the politicians, they send the orders, but the ones that are in charge of applying them are the public officials and are the public procurement practitioners. So each one of us, we face this challenge of make sure that the policies and the practice, they work together. And public procurement really matters because you will see that this is a chart taken from the Government at a Glance publication of the OECD. The OECD average is 12% of the GDP in terms of public procurement. Sweden is a little bit over that, it's like 16%, and it's more close to the EU average, which is between 18 to 20%. And the public procurement accounts for 30% of total government expenditures. So we are talking about a very significant amount of money. We are talking about, in OECD countries, we are talking roughly around 4.3 trillion US dollars. So it matters not just for the public side, but also for the private side, because you know it takes two to tango. So the private sector is really interested in public sector efficiency as well. And we conducted this survey from the business side of the OECD 2 years ago. And you will see that public sector efficiency was considered the second business priority area for reform after product market regulation. And within this area, public procurement was the top priority. So from the private sector, it's very important that the public sector is efficient, and it's good to see. I went through the delegates list and I saw many of you coming from the private sector. So it's really a pleasure to see so many delegates coming from the private sector and interested in public procurement. We have been working with public procurement reforms around the globe for many years now. We developed several work streams. We bring together some evidence and data. So we have the Government at a Glance publication. We are developing some work on key performance indicators that I will talk later on. We also advise countries on a regular basis. We conduct hands-on peer reviews to provide assessment of public procurement systems. So we are working currently, for instance, with the Central Purchasing Body of Chile or with the Mexican government. But we also worked with Korea, with Northern Ireland. We are working with the European Union to foster reforms in some of the European Union member states, like for instance Slovakia and Bulgaria. We worked with Greece to implement the Central Purchasing Body 2 years ago. So we have a wide, diversified range of work within the countries. We also work on a sectoral level. We work with health, we work with energy as well. And at the same time, we are working closely with the G20. We developed public procurement principles for the G20. They were adopted last year. And it's a very interesting policy dialogue. And we also try to bring together, we have a network of the leading practitioners on public procurement network. Some of you that are present here are members of this network and are attending our meetings. And we try to organize this policy dialogue in order to bring recommendations to countries to foster their reforms. And finally, we are trying also to have best practices and in terms of standards on public procurement areas. We developed a compendium on green procurement that I will talk about. We also have one on integrity, and we just finalized a survey on innovation. And we are going to publish by the end of the year some work and some good practices how to develop the procurement for innovation. So, taking into consideration the work that we have been doing in the public procurement field, it comes as no surprise that our major findings, and we can call it a magic recipe, but it's not just by applying these principles that you will get a sound and efficient public procurement system, unfortunately, because there is always, of course, the human factor involved. But basically, if we have rules and procedures that are simple, clear, ensure access to procurement opportunities, if we have effective institutions, if we use the appropriate electronic tools, and if we are capable to manage and develop human resources to plan and carry procurement processes, and finally, if after all of these we still are capable of doing competent contract management, I believe that we are on the very good way to develop a good public procurement system. So basically, because of all this work and because of all this thinking, analytical analysis as well, we developed the 2015 OECD recommendation on public procurement. So the first recommendation of the OECD on public procurement came because of integrity. It was integrity focused, integrity related. But since then, since 2008, we have expanded our thinking, we have expanded our work as well. And that's why we developed this new recommendation that moves from an administrative and compliance-based analysis of public procurement into a more broader and strategic use in order to achieve government policies. We have 12 integrated principles. I'm not going to develop them. In the presentation, I prepared some backup slides for each of the principles, so you will see that the principles range from transparency to integration, from e-procurement to integrity, from efficiency to capacity. So we try to cover the entire scope of the public procurement cycle, and we think this recommendation is capable of being applied to each public procurement system, regardless of the level, regardless if it's a national, subnational, sectoral system. So we do believe it's a standard for this century. So we are trying to come up with an international reference for public procurement standards. And we are developing this recommendation. We are now implementing the recommendation. So each of the OECD member countries, the 34, they, of course, accept and adopt the recommendation. And in principle, their procurement systems follow the OECD recommendation. And to develop the OECD recommendation, we did a very large consultation process that involved the international organizations, each of the member countries, and the IFIs, for instance. And the final text of the recommendation reflects all of this consultation process. And Sue mentioned that the EU directives are becoming, you know, from these to these, but our recommendation, in fact, is very, very small. You can read it in half an hour, and I strongly advise each of you to go and read it, because I think it's a good policy paper. But not just a policy paper, but also the recommendation will serve to develop all these instruments and tools that I have in this slide. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the maps. Do you know the maps? One person knows the maps. So the maps is the methodology for the assessment of procurement systems. It was developed by the World Bank and OECD 10 years ago, and it was targeting emerging and developing countries only. But now, with the new thinking around public procurement and with the change that occurred in the world recently, and I never expected to come to Stockholm in the pinnacle of winter and be able to walk without a warm coat and just with a suit. You know? So things are really changing. The climate is affecting the world, but also the public procurement policy is changing. So we are now developing a new maps that will encompass all these reforms, and that is going to be used for assessing public procurement systems, not just in emerging countries, but also in OECD countries. And we were able to bring together all of the IFIs, the World Bank, the EBRD, WTO, the UNCITRAL, around the table to discuss the new and revised maps, which I think it will come out by the end of the year, and it's going to be a very good way of assessing and self-assessing as well a public procurement system. I will give you now some data about the evidence that we collected about the strategic use of public procurement. You know, each one of you knows that public procurement is used more and more to achieve secondary policy objectives. What do we mean by secondary policy objectives? We mean, of course, green public procurement, sustainable procurement, but also the support to SMEs, the support to procure innovative goods and services, and also in some countries and in some regions, for instance in Latin America, the support of women-owned businesses or other minority groups. So in terms of the policy development, you will see that moving from green to innovation, there is a difference. Green is the most common secondary policy objective for public procurement, while innovation is now catching up a little bit. And we run this survey every 2 years. This year we will launch the survey as well in order to be published next year. So from 2012 to 2014, you will see that there is an increasing trend in terms of developing strategies for secondary policy objectives in public procurement. But these strategies are not evenly developed. They are more developed for green public procurement and less developed for innovation, which I believe it's easy to understand. And sometimes targets are fixed, and sometimes the governments are not capable of fixing objectives for these strategies. Even more surprising is that measuring the results is not also possible. For the green part, the vast majority, 2/3 of the countries are measuring the results, but for innovation, less than 40% are measuring the results. So I will just briefly give you some ideas about the work that we did for the Going Green. We call it Going Green. So in terms of developing green procurement strategies, the will is there, but there are some challenges in order to achieve this objective. First of all, because there is this fear that green products, they cost more. There is the lack of technical knowledge as well, lack of monitoring, as we saw it before, absence of incentives, and lack of suppliers. So in order to overcome these challenges, we developed this compendium. And the compendium was designed around 6 policy areas. The compendium is online. You can go to our website and see the cases we collected from OECD countries. So each case is organized under the different area. So we have one for legal and policy framework. We have one for planning green public procurement and assessing life cycle costs. We have one also for environmental standards, and also professionalization, the raising awareness of buyers and markets, and finally some mechanisms to monitor green projects. And I believe these 6 practice areas, they are possible to apply to other policy areas as well, like for instance SMEs or innovation. So we will now design the innovation compendium around also these concepts. Because I know that you are also talking about central purchasing in this conference, I tried to come up with some information about the way countries are moving into central purchasing. You will see that for the last survey we conducted some questions around the central purchasing, and it's interesting to see that in different areas the legal status of CPBs is not always the same. But mostly they are either government agencies or under the control of the ministries. And the role of CPBs, they vary from just coordinating and training public officials to the more common role of acting as a manager of the national system to award framework agreements or consolidated instruments, and also to aggregate demand and purchasing. But it's very interesting to realize that the results of the CPBs are not measured at all, or are roughly measured across the OECD countries. You will see that they are mostly measured only on an internal basis. So in fact, the ministries that are setting up the objectives for the CPBs still are lagging behind in terms of developing quantitative and clear objectives in order to monitor and manage the CPB implementation. So the final part of my presentation is going to be on KPIs. We all talk about measuring public procurement. How can we, in fact, apply quantitative measuring for public procurement performance? And since some years now, we are thinking about how to move forward these key performance indicators. In the first meeting of the leading practitioners on public procurement, we start thinking about this. And we developed 4 areas of indicators. The areas are the efficiency of the public procurement cycle, the openness and transparency, the professionalization of the public procurement workforce, and finally the contract performance management. So we work together with some countries. So we are talking about national agencies, we are talking about policymakers, we are talking about practitioners. So we developed indicators for each of the areas. And we also did a stock-taking report to see how the countries were, in fact, moving in each of these areas. And it was very interesting to see that the countries, they are, in fact, collecting a significant amount of data, but they really don't know what to do with it. So they use the information for transparency and accountability, to check the boxes and for compliance purposes, but they don't use the information for performance. So we started a pilot project, and we decided to create a pilot project around the indicators that we developed to see, in fact, in practice, how countries were applying the key performance indicators to the public procurement. So the first area, we managed to get some results, and these are evidence from the use of contracting mechanisms. So our indicators are really like formulas, so we try to come up with evidence, with numbers, with figures. But you will see as we move along these 4 areas, it was not possible for us to get information from some of the countries. And some of the countries, in fact, they told us, not going to name them, but very advanced, developed countries in the world, they told us, that will take a long time to develop. We don't have the capacity. We don't have the systems in place to collect this information, so we are not going to do it. But you will see here that it's interesting to see how the use of consolidated consolidated mechanisms or framework agreements are increasing over time. And it's also to see how the use of e-procurement is also uptaking in terms of the OECD countries. So this pilot project was applied to 10 OECD countries. And you will see from 2010 to 2014 there is, in fact, an uptake of e-procurement. And in the efficiency part as well, we tried to understand how countries were collecting information about savings, about the efficiency of the procurement process. And in fact, they are collecting information for goods more than for services, which is, of course, easy to understand as well. And in terms of savings, these are some categories that were identified in terms of identifying savings. In terms of services, these are the areas that where countries were capable of providing evidence for savings as well. So we moved from efficiency to openness and transparency, and it was also possible to follow the way countries were developing competition, how the procurement procedures were helping the procurement process to be more competitive and open. And you will see that, in fact, the open tendering is increasing as well, but there is also an increase in the single sourcing. But from this indicator on, it was more and more difficult to get real data. So the pilot project, unfortunately, was not capable to develop indicators for the professionalization and for the other area as well. So finally, before concluding, I would say that in this regard, there is still the lack of nationwide data on public procurement. I don't know if it's the case in Sweden or not. There is discrepancy between the roles of CPBs across countries. And I know that Sweden, for instance, you have 2 big CPBs. And I don't know if their role is clear or if it's compatible or not. And we are struggling a little bit about the use of the different contracting mechanisms across the globe and the classification of sectors. In the survey that we are going to launch, we are going to get evidence about the use of public procurement within the sectors. So moving from just the percentage of GDP, but going into detail how public procurement is applied to health, to education, to IT, to other sectors, in order to get a better understanding how governments are applying public resources. So with this, I conclude my presentation. You have plenty of information about the OECD work on our website. I will also give you these backup slides with the 12 principles of the OECD recommendation. And to answer the question that was in the first slide, well, I do believe we have a solid, a good instrument that is capable of being a standard for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Your conclusion there in the 3 bullet points, what would be your advice for the European countries to meet those challenges?
Well, I would advise, well, now the EU directives are strongly suggesting the use of e-procurement. I believe with the e-procurement and with a single approach, coordinated approach to e-procurement, we will be capable of overcoming many of the challenges because the information will be available. It's a question of being smart and clever in order to use the information and the data that will be available.
Okay, jag har inte fått in några frågor. We have no questions in our SMS text system so far. Är det någon som vill ställa en fråga till vår föredragshållare? Any questions for our lecturer here? Yes? Yeah, please, we have a microphone over there. Please tell us who you are and ask your question.
I'm Sue. I was talking this morning, but if nobody else has a question.
I was using my reading glasses. Ah, there you are. Thank you very much.
So as nobody else has a question, I thought I would ask one, because I'm very, very interested in that slide on measuring results of what you call secondary policies, which I would call horizontal policies now. When we did a survey of it was about 20 years ago, nobody seemed to be measuring the results. But I'm interested to know what you mean by measuring the results, because when I see governments measure results, they will look at just superficially. We're trying to promote SMEs. Did SMEs get the contracts? Or we're trying to promote employment of the unemployed. Were they being used on the contracts? But they don't measure what would have happened without the policies. And they also don't measure longer-term results. So were these people still in employment in the sector once this 3-month contract ended? Or did these SMEs grow and develop? And they also don't measure the costs. And when they do measure the costs, they find that they're very high. So when you talk about measurement, I'm interested in the definition and whether it really gets into the real, actual long-term benefits and the costs, or whether it's just this superficial measure of were there some jobs coming along here, which you can present to the public as a success without really looking at it in further detail. So how do you define, measure the results? I think there's a big difference between the first one and the last one.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. So we have a principle for secondary policy objectives. We call it balance. So the idea is we are kind of neutral about the use of secondary policy objectives, but if a country engages into using procurement for achieving other policy goals, we strongly suggest the countries to develop cost-benefit analysis, impact assessment, and to go deep into the quantitative analysis. So to answer your question, yes, we do believe if the country engages into secondary policy objectives, it should be capable of developing a strategy including objectives that are quantitative and then following that up with impact assessment. This is the general trend or the general policy that we are advising countries. But some of our countries, some of our members, they use procurement for secondary policy objectives and they don't really care about the cost. For instance, Korea is very keen on innovation and SMEs, and they know that there is a cost for that, but they really don't care about the cost of the use of procurement for that. So they know that they use procurement for that, but they really don't measure it because it's embedded into their thinking that procurement should be used to achieve these secondary policy objectives without quantifying the cost.
Okay, thank you. And I guess we have to move on a bit. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.